This video will be a take on the classic rock, paper, and scissors, but with Python. For those unfortunate souls who have not heard of the game, let me elaborate. There are two players. And they both randomly make gestures with their hand and bring out either rock, paper, or scissor. The logic is as follows. This is the logic. So rock beats scissor and loses to paper. Paper beats rock and loses to scissor. Scissor beats paper and loses to rock. Now that we have understood the basic logic of the game, let us see how we can translate this into an algorithm. As I mentioned previously, there are two players. So player 1 and player 2. Let me rename this a bit. I am renaming player 1 as computer and player 2 as the player. Now computer will be the one that will randomly generate output, and player will be the one which we will take as user input and can opt for any of the options between rock, paper, and scissor. Now this is the main logic. If computer is equal to player, then we will print tie. That means if the computer and the player options are the same, we will print tie. What does this actually mean? It means that if computer chooses rock and the player also chooses rock, it means it's a tie. However, if a player chooses rock and the computer doesn't choose rock, there are two other options that the computer could have chosen: paper or scissor. Now, if it chooses paper, the player will lose because rock loses to paper. However, if the computer chooses scissor, the player will win because rock beats scissor. This is exactly what we did. This is the logic. If a computer chooses paper, then the player will lose if the player is rock, or else it will win. Notice that this is done in a nested loop. As a result, we have to indent it as follows. Okay, now let's move on to the next option. If a player chooses paper and if the computer doesn't choose paper as well, if the computer chooses paper, it will be printed in this option. So it leaves two other options, which is rock and scissor. Now we know that if the player chooses paper and the computer chooses scissor, the player will lose because paper loses to scissor. And if it chooses rock, then it will win. Now we don't need to explicitly mention this with another else if question because there is no other option but rock. Now moving on to, if a player chooses rock, then it has two other options. It can either be paper or it can be scissor. Now if the computer chooses paper, the player will lose because rock loses to paper, and if the computer chooses scissor, then the player will win. Understand this part very carefully because I will not be talking about this again in the code. I will just show you how to code, but this is an important logic to understand. Here we are also using nested if-else conditions or nested loops. For the past couple of videos, we have seen how to use random, but here we are specifying it even a bit more. Now here we are importing randint directly from random, and as a result, when we use randint, we don't need to write random.randint because we have already specified from where this is. For the first time in this video series, we are creating a list or an array. Here we have a variable named option, and we are initializing it with three elements: rock, paper, and scissor. And just like the rules of array, the zeroth element constitutes to rock, the first element paper, and the second element scissor. Here we are assigning computer, and computer can choose any of the following options, but this is going to be chosen randomly. So if it decides to choose 0, it will be rock. If it chooses to decide 1, it will be paper, and if it decides to choose 2, it will be scissor. I will explain why we set this part as false. Let's move on to the logic. Here we want an input from the player. What the computer decides will be done randomly, but the player has the option of choosing something. It can choose either rock, paper, or scissor, which is why we are using this input portion, and if it's equal to the computer, it will be tie. The rest of this is elaborated in details in the algorithm, so I will not be going over this. However, what it's important to realize here is that there is a nested loop at play. As you can see, we have indented this portion, so this portion is the nested loop of else if. Here I wanted to make sure that the words match exactly, which is why I've exempted another condition to ensure that the spelling is correct. Now let's go back to player is equal to false. What does setting player is equal to false mean? It means that the player has no value initialized to it. And this loop will continue as long as the player has no value assigned to it. The reason we set this as false is to begin the loop and to continue running it. Once the player selects an input, it now has a value which is set to true. At the end of the program, we decide to set it as false so the loop can continue again. I hope you've understood how this works. Now let me run the program and show you the output. I've run the program and now it wants an option. Suppose I choose rock. The computer chose paper and I chose rock. And we know that in rock, paper, scissor, rock loses to paper, and as a result I lost. Let me choose scissor. And you can see that it's not a valid play because I have not adhered to the spelling. So let me correct the spelling and play again. Scissors. It's a tie because the computer also chose rock. And this is how this works. I know it's a little bit more advanced, but still simple. But we have included the options of, we have included array and such, and arrays and nested loop at play in this portion.